You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Hey y'all, Michael again. This is the second installment in a two-parter about the lost colony. Just to refresh your memory, England had tried at least once, and arguably 4 or 5 times, to establish a military outpost on Roanoke Island and met with disaster across the board. A couple of years later, though, Sir Walter Raleigh sent a colony of civilians, tradespeople and artists and artisans and farmers. These were families with kids, even some orphaned children who were to be cared for and raised by the whole community collectively. Problems beset them literally the moment they arrived as well, and the governor of the colony got told by the colonists that he needed to go back to England with the ships that brought them in order to get more supplies and to recruit more colonists. And he went, promising to be back in a few months. So imagine that you are standing there watching your father, the governor of the colony, row out to a ship to leave that colony, to leave you. Your neighbors have in fact forced him to leave. England is an inconceivably far distance away, and you fully expect that you will never see it again. And everyone knows war with Spain could happen anytime. And in that context, his ship disappears over the horizon. But you wait for him to come back because he said he would, and he never does. That part of the story absolutely grips me. As I researched this episode, I thought over and over again of how it must have felt to watch those ships sail away and to know there was little to do but wait for them to return and try to make it on your own while you do. One of the books I read about the lost colony in the course of this research referred to the entire effort to establish a colony on Roanoke as the Elizabethan equivalent to the Apollo program, both in terms of the money it took and the organizational effort it required, but also in terms of how risky it was and how uncertain were the outcomes. We talk about all the bad luck one convoy after another encountered in the course of the first episode, but those hardships were not necessarily the result of shoddy work or lousy crews. There are a lot of incorrect assumptions that got made and a lot of arrogance. There's plenty of blame to spread around. But also, each trip to Roanoke was, by the standards of the people making it, a moonshot. And the place they left to go there was every bit as far away to them as the Earth seemed to any astronaut who's ever left it and looked back. But think of this also from the natives' perspectives. The first attempt at a colony was an army. They were an invading force, and there wasn't really any other context in which to see them. A literal army showed up with weapons, started making more weapons, demanding food, and everywhere they went in search of gold and silver, the native people died. And now there were more of them? But this time they've brought children. They brought families. Compared to the soldiers in the first attempt, these people were barely even armed. Imagine if tomorrow aliens came down in a UFO and a big plank extended from their flying saucer. How would you feel if a bunch of soldiers armed with ray guns walked down the plank? And then how would you feel if instead, or if 2 years later, the beings walking down that plank onto a landscape as alien to their eyes as they would be to ours were alien parents huddled with alien children, and they approached with fear in their eyes? So with that in mind, Charlie and I asked, where did the lost colony go?
So the theory that I'd always heard was that it wasn't a particularly violent region and that somebody had like basically taken pity on the settlers and been like, all right, dum-dums, like you can come this way. We're not going to let you starve to death. But I don't know about that now.
Well, so a popular theory was they were killed by Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Only that's been a popular theory since colonists at Jamestown were told that by some people who had a very significant agenda behind telling them that.
Right. It doesn't sound like there's any evidence to support that.
In fact, the person who wrote the most popular version of that was a racist who never left England, much less visited the colonies and talked to anybody, who wrote an explicitly racist screed saying that the Native Americans should be exterminated.
Right. Just like not even viewing people as people.
There was an artifact called the Dare Stone that was discovered in 1937 that features a cross etched into it and purports to be a report by the mother of Virginia Dare saying, we all got murdered by Native Americans, and you should take this to my father in England and tell him what happened, and he'll reward you. And for a long time, there were people who pointed to that as like, that's the proof that they were murdered. But a show on the History Channel actually just recently did serious scientific study of the Dare Stone and demonstrated that no, letters supposedly etched into it were actually formed with a drill bit.
That's awesome.
And they actually proved it by producing a replica of it, a fake of their own, using a drill bit from the 30s. And It's the same under microscopic examination. So the Dare Stone is totally fake.
Go History Channel. Good for you.
Another theory is that they were discovered and killed by the Spanish, but the Spanish were still looking for them like 20 years later. The Spanish knew that there was a privateering base that the English wanted to establish. And they were actively hunting for it, but they never found it.
Also, I feel like that would leave violent remains or violent evidence.
Yeah.
There'd be burning and murdering.
There's another theory that the Croatan people turned on them, but there's like no reason to believe that. And importantly, again, there was no cross with the word Croatoan.
No cross, no bodies, nothing destroyed. And who would have moved the treasure chests with the, in my head, they're treasure chests full of paintings.
Yeah. And then another theory is that White found them, reestablished contact, and that they became Sir Walter Raleigh's secret supply of sassafras, because Sir Walter Raleigh did get rich on sassafras later. But the price
I got a guy.
Yeah, right. The price of sassafras didn't go up until the late 1590s. He would have had no idea to plan for that. It was something that was maybe going to be profitable, but not profitable enough to hide or abandon 115 people that way.
Right.
There's even a theory that the Cora tree is tied up in all this somehow, and that's an instance of another message having been left by the lost colony.
Oh, get out.
But like, come on. We know.
No.
Yeah, we know that's not true.
We have successfully and rebunked that at the same time.
Yeah. And also, another reason why I don't think that Raleigh was operating this as a secret sassafras farm is because he didn't mention the fate of the lost colonists again for a long time. And the main reason why he would have never talked about them again, really, is that as long as he didn't say they were dead, he could say they were there. And as long as he said they were there, he could maintain his charter over the Virginia colony.
Yeah.
So he didn't want to go looking for fear of what he'd find.
Exactly.
And in the meantime, he focused on going to South America and trying to find El Dorado, lost city of gold. One of his sassafras expeditions apparently did try to go to Croatan Island. And guess what? Bad weather forced them away before they could land. So yeah, it's kind of a place people are not supposed to go.
I mean, bad weather forced me off the island when I was in Hatteras.
So that's where the story ends in terms of facts.
Interesting.
Even at that time, though, White very explicitly believed that the colonists simply moved and then joined the Croatan Indians. He himself described finding the word Croatoan carved into the palisade was proof that they had safely relocated. Like that was his word, proof. In the 1650s and again in the early 1700s, other explorers encountered Native Americans on what's now Hatteras Island. And those people told explorers that they were descendants of an English colony and the Croatan people. They knew the name of Sir Walter Raleigh. They described books and writing and knew how that worked. And they told the first recorded version of the burning ghost ship off of Hatteras story.
Really?
They told explorers that they occasionally saw a burning ship appear off the coast and that it was Sir Walter Raleigh coming back to look for them.
Interesting, because that's a story that we've been that's another one that we've been kind of sitting on, that's been in our orbit, but we haven't really done a thing on.
Yeah. But what's now Hatteras is 50 miles south, not west.
Right.
In 2011, the First Colony Foundation, working with the British Museum, identified a patch on one of White's original watercolor maps of the Sounds and the inland part that he knew had been explored. And through fortuitous happenstance, they were able to study the back of the map and project light through the back of the map, which had never been possible for reasons that are lengthy. And when they did, they found the symbol that was used at the time on English maps for an English fort. And they were able to base the authorship of this part of it on the types of ink used and the fact that it was the same ink that White had used for the rest of the map. It looked like White had drawn a fort and then used another piece of parchment to patch over it, cover it up like whiteout, and then drew it again using invisible ink.
Secret sassafras.
Secret sassafras, but also trying to hide the fact that that's where they would have gone if they went 50 miles inland.
Strange.
So the First Colony Foundation goes to the place where that is, and they had some locations they were already interested in, and they started digging, and they found bits of pottery that are specific to the Elizabethan time period and that decreased in popularity after the time of the founding of the Lost Colony, that they say is evidence that at least part of the colonists moved inland to go live with the Chuan. And when I mentioned in the Susanna Evans story that there was evidence that the Choanoke Indians had granted the English 2 reservations to farm on, that's part of the evidence.
Right.
And at the same time, the Lost Colony Foundation was on Hatteras Island finding what they call a survivors camp, where they have found extensive artifacts of like gold earrings from the colonists being turned into fish hooks, things like that. Yeah. And specifically, they found items that were unique to English women. And that's important because the Lost Colony was the first, and for its period, the only colony to include women.
Okay.
Because instead of sending a military presence, they sent families to establish a town.
Right. I can't believe that. I really do think they disintegrated into another society because, like, otherwise they would have found bodies, right?
Well, and if you think about being these colonists and you see your founder that you have told to leave, sail away, and he says, okay, I don't want to leave, but I'll be back. And then a year passes.
Mm-hmm.
And then another year passes. And then another year passes. And he's not coming back.
No.
And you haven't seen any English ships because all the English ships aren't allowed to leave because they have to join the fleet to fight the Spanish. And you start thinking, all we've seen are Spanish ships. Has Spain conquered England? Does England even exist anymore?
Right.
And what options do they have? And there's really strong scientific evidence that there was a record-setting drought in this area during specifically the years that they were abandoned by the English.
Good timing.
And so, like, short on food, not a lot of good options. What do? They probably split into factions, or they decide to just increase the odds of any of their survival. And they split up. And some of them go inland and go live with the Chuan, and some of them go south. And then the landscape changes and the cultures change, and they integrate into these Native American populations.
Right.
And there you get it.
I mean, we've talked about assimilation and how it only takes a couple of generations, right? It only takes a generation or two. And then, like, you're like, oh, yeah, there's a thing that my great grandparents did from some sort of Scotch-Irish tradition. I don't know. So,
and hanging out there in the open is that the Lumbee tribe, which we've talked about many times, describes themselves explicitly as the descendants of the Native American people of Hatteras Island and the Lost Colony.
Right. And that's what I'm saying. Like, it's just amalgamation happens and it's
in their history. They've been sitting there telling everybody for like 200 years, Lost Colony was never lost. They turned into us.
Right. We're it.
I just find it fascinating. So why is it called the Lost Colony? Because a guy in the 1830s wrote a book and he played it up because he was trying to create a national myth on the scale of King Arthur.
I mean, it worked. People love telling like, Bigfoot got them.
Yeah. In these days, the Virginia
aliens.
Dare, there were also some like novels that were written in which Virginia Dare is cast as this like heroic princess of the English who's like surviving by her wits in the wilderness. They're really sketchy novels. They're explicitly fiction, but also like the message that they contain is pretty iffy. And these days, in fact, there are a couple of explicitly white supremacist organizations who hold her up as this heroic figure. So it gets a little creepy when you start thinking about it.
I learned something today.
Yeah,
like,
there's an organization that calls themselves VDARE. And they're a white supremacist hate organization. And they are like, we're preserving the culture of Virginia Dare, et cetera, et cetera. So
that baby.
Like when people get too into the Virginia Dare part of it, that's a red flag.
Okay. I learned something today. I didn't know that.
Yeah. But it seems to me like the Lost Colony was never lost. They just joined the Native American tribes.
And that was always my understanding of it, was that like they weren't there and they went off into the wilderness and lived amongst the people that were already there.
Yeah. It's interesting to me as a footnote in the Wikipedia article about this, and I want to go read more. It is noted that almost every indigenous person who was forced into a European cultural setting during this time period immediately escaped it at their first opportunity and went back to their people.
Sure.
Almost no one of European heritage who joined a Native American society during this period ever wanted to go back.
I mean, why would you? If for lack of a better word, it kind of sucked. Like life wasn't great during this time period.
Yeah. And the Native American cultures largely had a much more egalitarian take on things. Women were able to own property and hold political power and all sorts of things. And these people knew how to survive and they lived well, while the English, by their standards, just like starved, just constantly starved.
Would you rather be under the boot of a monarch or would you rather be in North America?
Yeah.
Freedom intensifies.
It just seems like the lost colony was never lost. And I just think that's so fascinating.
No, it's outstanding. I learned a lot today, but I'm glad that my 25-cent version that I came up thinking was the story is reasonably, like, you didn't undo it. Like I'm still on that.
Okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm like, oh yeah, that lines up. No, that all tracks. I'm on board with this. I was expecting you to be like, and then they found all the bodies and they died here and it was horrible. And
no, I kind of wish I could, just because then we'd know the answer. But
all right.
But I feel like we know the answer.
Yeah. Good with it. I mean, it's the whole, what is the simplest explanation, right? What makes the most sense? And that does makes more sense than like, they got abducted by aliens. That's a different episode where I get to fly that flag and talk about aliens. I don't think that needs to cross-pollinate with the Lost Colony.
No, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks a lot. Michael again. When we finished that up, we thought we were done with the topic. But then in the course of tidying up some of my notes and doing a little more reading just for fun, I ran across more information on these sites that are currently under investigation as possible places the colonists went. I feel like we didn't do them justice in this episode, and I feel like we, in fact, maybe were inaccurately dismissive of one in particular, so I wanted to add a little more here. First, with Site X and Site Y. These are locations more or less in the vicinity of the Choanoke people, who had multiple villages, towns, and a large city of thousands of people along the Chuan River. Charlie and I talked about them in the Susanna Evans Accused Witch episode a few episodes back. Anyway, the First Colony Foundation has found pottery shards specific to a particular region and time period of England in at least 2 locations in what was the territory of the Choanoke at the time. In part, that pottery is significant because it's of a style that was quickly replaced by another style as more fashionable in the early part of the 1600s, a few years after the Roanoke colony's various attempted foundings. So those sites could be places where English colonists set up shop a couple of decades after Roanoke, more in the era of the Jamestown colony, but if so, they were using distinctly unfashionable pottery. The other reason those dig sites are important, however, is the absence of clay pipes, which, as we mentioned earlier, were all the rage among the English. No English settler would have been without a clay pipe if they were in the area after, say, 15 years past the founding of the Lost Colony. But the Lost Colony would not have had clay pipes. It's important to remember that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But everywhere else we know the English set up colonies after, say, 1610, there are pipes everywhere. Also, Site X and Site Y are almost exactly 50 miles inland from the Roanoke colony, exactly the distance and direction John White said the colonists told him they planned to go. Now, none of that negates the findings of the Lost Colony Center, however. The folks who found the survivor camps, quote-unquote, in multiple locations on what is now Hatteras Island. Those survivor camps show clearly that there were countless English artifacts in use in Croatan towns and villages on what was then Croatoan Island and is now Hatteras Island. It's also where later explorers and settlers encountered native people who said explicitly that they were the descendants of the Roanoke colonists and the Croatan people, and were seeing a ghost ship on the water and saying it was the specter of Sir Walter Raleigh. As I said to Charlie, those survivor campsites have a tremendous array of artifacts of all types, but importantly, they include women's jewelry, and the Lost Colony was the first colony and the only colony of its time to include women at all. The Lost Colony Center's archaeological work is ongoing, and there are all kinds of new discoveries being made, so I think there will be more learned as time goes on. That means the picture of what happened or seems to have happened, or what might be possible as what happened, might shift and change. It's important to stay open to that and to welcome new information and to adapt our views to new information when it presents itself. But for now, I'd say they've got a rock-solid case with loads of physical evidence that at least some of the colonists went 50 miles south and integrated into the Croatan people. But after recording with Charlie, I read about a third potential discovery. This one is more hypothetical in some ways and does not have the tremendous amount of hard archaeological data backing it up. However, it's also a possibility raised by the Lost Colony Center, so they've shown their ability to go looking for history and to find it. Also, they don't seem dogmatic about any of the locations they've found. In fact, none of the groups looking for archaeological evidence of the Lost Colony's eventual fate has claimed that they've found the only answer. And in a time of people loving to claim the monopoly on information or perspective, that's pretty refreshing to see. This third location is in a place referred to by many names over time on various maps, but the one I saw used multiple times is Beachland. That was a community on the mainland across the Sound from Roanoke Island in modern-day Dare County. There were numerous indigenous towns and villages in that region along the Alligator River, and shortly after the Lost Colony quote-unquote disappeared, the Croatan people were able to expand into those towns and villages and take them over after they were abandoned by other tribes. Basically, the moment the Lost Colony disappears, the Croatan become a major political, economic, and military force in the area, and their population and territory rapidly expand. The Lost Colony Center links to a 2010 doctoral dissertation from NC State University, written by Philip S. McMullen, Jr., in which he proposes that the colonists broke into multiple groups and integrated into or established their own villages near existing indigenous population centers in the region so as to reduce the strain they presented on local food supplies. Remember what I said to Charlie, this was a time of record drought, well documented in core samples from trees in that region that were alive then and are still alive now. McMullen points to the fact maps as early as 50 or 60 years after the Lost Colony was abandoned label parts of the inland regions as Croatan instead of labeling Croatoan or Hatteras Island as the place where the Croatan people lived. And these locations are also exactly 50 miles into the main or inland if we take into account the indirect route necessitated to get there over water. Maps from this era contain two other important features. First, the locations of various towns seem to shift around when compared to the map John White, that governor of the colonists sent back to England as soon as they arrived. Some people, including McMullen, believe White's maps may have been incorrect on purpose in an effort to hide the colony and locations important to it from Spanish spies. Remember, Spain and England had been in a Cold War for decades, and now they were in a hot war. And in fact, a bunch of what we know from the historical record comes to us from intelligence gathered by Spaniards, who did a better job of preserving it than the English did. A case in point, one of those maps McMullen studied, and one of the best early maps by Europeans, is called the Zuniga map, because that's the name of the Spanish spy who stole it from the English court and sent a copy back to Spain. We don't actually know which explorer made the original. And second, the location of Beachland is marked on one of the maps that was studied by McMullen using an illustration of a sassafras tree, labeled sassafras tree. It's the only labeled tree on a map of the region from 1651 and the only sassafras tree depicted, where other types of trees are depicted in other locations. And by overlaying multiple maps to show that they independently confirm one another across decades and even centuries, a different paper by McMullen when he was studying at East Carolina University, this time with a fellow researcher named Fred Willard, shows that this is the region to which others referred when they said things such as that the indigenous people around Jamestown told the settlers there they knew of a place where people wore English-style clothes far to the south. McMullen's theory across the various research papers by him that I read is that the Roanoke settlers joined the Croatan in moving inland, set up in the area later referred to as Beachland, and established a farming community trading sassafras back to England. He notes that an initial survey of the area in the 1970s and 1980s in preparation for a real estate deal that ended up falling through found what looked like old-school English wells, a graveyard, possibly even caskets. sites, but that the full archaeological survey recommended at the time, nearly 50 years ago now, never happened. Also, the legend of Beachland has persisted in that area for many years, and that legend is nothing less than an oral history passed down in many families from one generation to the next, that they were the descendants of members of the Roanoke colony who merged with the Croatan and moved inland to establish towns and farms and set up exactly the life they left England to lead. Beachland remained continuously occupied until the 1840s. The legend has it that the residents fled when an infectious disease struck, but research has shown the population shrank more gradually and eventually the town was abandoned. But 250 years earlier, at the close of the 16th century, that location would have been one of the best protected places with good land, plenty of sassafras, fresh water, and friendly faces where an English colony could hide from the Spaniards they knew were continuously searching for them. McMullen and the Lost Colony Center also point out that Sir Walter Raleigh sent nearly 300 missions to or within just a few miles of the Outer Banks region in the years immediately after the Lost Colony supposedly disappeared. Those missions came back with sassafras, just loaded down with the stuff. That's how he paid for more missions. But many don't even mention the Outer Banks, despite necessarily sailing right past them, right past the place where they knew the colonists had been left. And whereas I noted when talking to Charlie that sassafras didn't reach the peak of its value at market until several years later, and so that didn't seem to make it believable that this was some sort of secret sassafras operation, and in fact I had seen others use that to debunk that idea, it's recorded in reports from that very first expedition show up, that one from before the colony, before even the military outpost, that the English knew sassafras was going to be valuable in Europe as a source of medicines. That very first mission, the one that got treated well for 6 weeks and fed and told, yeah, come on back and let's trade a bunch. They brought sassafras back with them to England, and Raleigh financed his personal fortune and his search for El Dorado with money he made from a monopoly on the sassafras trade coming from North America for the better part of the next 20 years. As McMullen says in his research, what are the odds Raleigh sent nearly 300 missions and none of them made contact with colonists or even tried? McMullen goes so far as to suggest perhaps some of those missions even brought additional colonists, perhaps even the families of the original colonists who had left families behind to take the trip in 1587. I mean, if we're going to entertain the possibility that Sir Walter Raleigh was covering up a major resource extraction enterprise on the coast of what's now North Carolina, why not? McMullen frames it as the lost colony was not abandoned until Sir Walter Raleigh was executed in 1603. To be honest, when I was reading Governor John White's account of his attempts to find the colonists when he did finally return in 1590, a lot of it kind of didn't make sense to me. I'm not an expert. I'm going to be the first person to say that. But why all the turning back and forth between destinations and chasing literal smoke signals? Why in August did they say they weren't able to go 50 miles south just to look where they knew the Croatan people would be? The winds and the depths of the sound side of the Outer Banks are notoriously unpredictable, and that region is called the graveyard of the Atlantic for a reason. But lots of other ships were able to visit those locations and stop at them, some for extended periods of time. Some even reported finding branded cattle and donkeys grazing on what is now Hatteras Island. So maybe that theory that Raleigh and his many business partners, a tangled web I will never have time to untangle, even in one lengthy addendum to one episode, but whose names keep showing up in various papers as financiers and organizers of missions to the New World, even when England's ships were all supposed to be fighting the Spanish Armada, and who kept bringing back sassafras by the ton and reporting they got it from places it doesn't grow. Well, maybe that theory does in fact have something to it. Maybe Raleigh did keep the colony's survival and their multiple locations a secret to protect his incredibly profitable business. There's a lot this theory doesn't explain, of course. Why would White never go back after 1590 if he knew his daughter and granddaughter were there? Why wouldn't clay pipes show up in the pottery shards left behind by Roanoke colonists granted territory by the Roanoke if they were there to engage in trade and continued to do so for years afterwards? Surely they too would have picked up the pipe smoking fad from the English who bought their goods, right? And how would so many people have kept the location of the colonists or locations of the colonists a secret for so long? Anybody who's ever done a group project in school or tried to keep juicy gossip from going too far, we know how likely it is that so many people would have so effectively kept something so valuable a secret. And at the same time, I keep going back to the thought of watching Governor White go back to his ship and sail out of view just as a record drought is about to set in. I suspect the colonists would have descended into factionalism If they sent their own governor packing against his wishes the moment they arrived, and obviously there were some tensions within the group. And even if they were nothing but amiable with each other, even if they had nothing but each other's best interests in mind, the practicalities of survival as the weather turned bad and crops dried up and the rain didn't come could have made splitting up an appealing choice. It could have made it the logical, practical choice. Maybe some of them went inland to the Choanook to establish farms and seek the precious metals trade so many were hoping to find. And maybe some went to Croatan to live with the Croatan there in view of the Atlantic, able to keep an eye out for returning English ships or Spanish raiders. And maybe the rest of them went with the Croatan people inland to occupy lands previously held by the Sikatan near the Yapam, where they would know they could grow crops and safely drink the water, and there were plenty of game to hunt and fish to catch. I don't know. I don't think we'll necessarily ever know, not down to the details of this person went here and that person went there and yada yada. But the native people of the coast have been telling us themselves literally for centuries that the lost colony was never lost. And I think one of the most interesting questions about it then is, why did the people they told choose not to listen? Like I said at the start, the lost colony is a rabbit hole with no end. There are hundreds of pages of research papers, serious academic research loaded with citations from original sources and trusted analyses over the centuries, and ongoing digs by professional archaeologists from major globally known universities, just on the Lost Colony Center's website alone. There's no way to talk about it and cover everything. And as promised, I did get Croatoan and Croatan confused a few times, and at least once in a way I could not fix with editing. So sorry about that. But I love topics like this, where the history is right there in front of us, waiting to be recognized and believed, when the people who are descended from them keep telling it to us. And I love the way this connects to so many other fascinating aspects of this time, from the English quest to find their own Panama, a way to get to the Pacific in a hurry, all the way to the medicinal properties of sassafras and the complex politics and economic systems of the Native American people in the region, and the sometimes fraught, sometimes friendly history of diplomacy between them. I love the way time and again the European powers got duped into bringing some kidnapped indigenous person back to their people. And I think it's important that we talk about the real and tragic consequences of that doomed quest. And when Charlie and I say history is everywhere, just waiting for us to learn about it, this kind of stuff is what we mean. So thanks for indulging us in this two-part episode, which may feel like a deep dive, but in fact, from what I can tell, is just the first inch of water in the sound-sized body of research and belief about the lost colony, and whether they were ever really lost, and what happened to them either way. We've enjoyed it, and we hope you have too. And as always, thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com, and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards.